Ernő Dohnányi, or Ernst von Dohnányi, is, in my opinion, probably the most underrated Hungarian composer of the 20th century. He was not just a composer, he was absolutely like a prodigious phenomenon at the time. He was piano virtuoso, a composer, of course, a teacher, a director of many institutions at his time. His career shot out as a superstar, almost the likes of Liszt or Cifra, and he was concerting internationally, he was performing everywhere, and his compositions were quite often played. Not to mention he was himself a conductor. What is interesting in Dohnányi's works, and probably the reason why he didn't become as well known or well appreciated as his compatriots Kodály or Bartók, is because his music was relatively old-fashioned, coming from the traditions of Brahms and Schubert and Bruckner, and he remained in this sound world. He sort of perfected it to the fullest, the romantic sound world. He was not an avant-gardist, if you think about it. At the same time when he was composing music beautiful to the ears, we had already Berg with Wozzeck, Schönberg, or Bartók, or Stravinsky, or Shostakovich composing the Nos. He was still in this sound world of aesthetic of the late 19th century and early 20th century. His contributions to music is enormous, and not just the contribution, but the fact that he was like a real powerhouse to the Hungarian culture, to the Hungarian cultural system. There was a time when Dohnányi was not just the dean of the Liszt Academy, but also at the same time the director of the Hungarian radio and chief conductor of the Budapest Philharmonic Society. He was basically ruling the musical life of Budapest at the same time when Bartók and Kodály were working, but somehow, because he used to have a lot of concerts and a lot of trips abroad, what became the signature profile of Bartók and Kodály, involving Hungarian folk music into the classical sound world, never really became his thing. His mother tongue was more the Brahmsian tradition, romantic music, the beauty of the sound, of the harmonies, something that he has perfected so much that if you listen to his works, it's like a painting with extremely bright colors, or eating a fruit that is so ripe, but at the same time you feel the sweetness, the bitterness, the sourness, at the same time the incredible softness. And this is how I would describe Dohnányi's music. One thing it is also very important in his music, what we are not going to hear tonight is humor. He was an incredibly humorous man. His compositions were full of musical jokes, musical reflections to other composers. He was a virtuoso in his compositions as well, in that sense that he was able to draw tunes from any style, from any particular composer, from any particular cultural background, and he incorporated it all in his music. The second symphony, however, that we are going to perform tonight is coming from a period of his life that was much more filled with doubts, with shadows, and with depressive things. Although it's his second symphony, this is his last symphony as well. He wrote it as a relatively old man in exile in the middle of the 40s when he had to leave Hungary for political reasons. He was for a long time staying there and using his positions to try to save the people who were ostracized, like the Jews. But at one point he couldn't stay himself, and then he had to leave. This period of his life in the 40s was, of course, a very difficult one, because he had to leave behind everything that he has built, and he was debating between life and death. And this symphony, which is his second and last symphony, completely lacks this kind of brilliance, this kind of spirited humor that all his other works, that was a trademark for all the other works. This symphony is much more about who we are. There is a deeper philosophical meaning. There is a famous writer and poet in Hungary called Imre Madács. He wrote a book, a poem called The Tragedy of the Man, az ember tragédiája. And Dohnányi names this work as basically the inspiration for the symphony. And it is debating, again, life and death. What is the meaning of life? What is the goal of life if everything goes towards death? Light and shadows, life and death, happiness and tragedy. This is something that very much lingers around this symphony. It has 4 movements, it's a gigantic work, and it is quite rarely performed. And first movement, we hear this philosophical question, who we are, what is our role in this universe. Then we end up in the second movement, which is a pastoral, a moment of stillness in the middle of all this storm. Then we have a very grotesque third movement, burla, which is almost like circus music, and it sort of brings back a little bit the memories of his youth where he was still capable of being humorous, but it is more like a work it's more like a satire, more like a cynical, grotesque work. And then finally the last movement that is using a famous chorale of Johann Sebastian Bach, Komm süßer Tod, Come you sweet death, that is actually the apotheose of this whole symphony. But then Dohnányi himself, he was a man of life, he was a man of joy, he was a man of pride, he was a man of enjoyment. So he couldn't resist himself, and all the midst of this kind of depression and turbulence in the world and in his own life, he manages somehow to bring out the victorious qualities, the nice qualities of life and the meaning of life towards the end of the symphony. So it has a glorious ending. The connection between the 2 works, between the second symphony of Dohnányi and the second piano concerto of Rachmaninov, first of all, there is a big difference. One is a work that is probably one of the most performed piano concertos of our times, and then we have a symphony that is probably one of the least performed works of our times. To combine those 2, it's a good thing for numerous reasons, not to mention ticket sales. Both Rachmaninov and Dohnányi ended up in exile. They both ended up in America. This is a similarity in their profile. Although this is a relatively early work for Rachmaninov and relatively late work of Dohnányi, they lived in the same period, they lived in the same time, and both of them chose to compose music that was following more the traditional old masters rather than becoming avant-gardist. Rachmaninov wrote this piano concerto when he was in a very depressed state of mind. He was 20-something, battling depression. His friends recommended him to see a psychiatrist, a famous psychiatrist at the time, who was able to help him coming out of this dark tunnel. And he finally dedicated his psychiatrist this beautiful piano concerto that resembles so much of the Slavic culture, starting from the church bells tolling in the very beginning until seeing these huge snowy steppes of the Mother Russia. This is something that is the trademark of this piano concerto, and this kind of somber quality and battling between light and shadow, it is also something that these both works share. And what is so beautiful and so human in both of them, at the end, love is winning, at the end, life is winning, at the end, humanity is winning. So this is the message of tonight's concert.